Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. First, I wanted to say thank you to the Allen County Public Library Genealogy Center for inviting me to speak with you today. It's truly an honor to be here. I know how precious research time is, so I really appreciate you choosing to spend some years with me. My name is Kelsey Kirby. I'm a genealogist and historian, and I'm the founder of Southern Charm Genealogy, where I specialize in researching families throughout the southern United States, especially those really stubborn brick walls. You know the kind. It's late at night, you've been searching for the same ancestor for hours, and you're starting to wonder if they ever existed at all. I've been there more times than I can count, and if you're here today, I'm guessing you probably have too. Today's talk is called Tracing Southern Families Through Brick Walls. And before we get into strategies or technique, I want to start with something important. If you've hit a brick wall in your Southern research, it is not because you're doing something wrong. Southern brick walls are incredibly common. They're often the direct result of historical reality, record loss from fires, floods, and wars, frequent migration, and informal record keeping practices that were just part of life at the time. These challenges are baked into Southern research itself, and they have nothing to do with your effort or your ability as a researcher. One of my main goals here today is to help take some of the frustration and self blame off your shoulders. Instead of focusing on what's missing, because there's always going to be something missing in Southern research, we're going to talk about how to change the way we approach these problems so we can still make meaningful progress when the paper trail is incomplete or messy. Over the next hour, we'll talk about why Southern brick walls tend to look different from brick walls in other regions, the mindset shift that often makes the biggest difference when you feel stuck, and some practical strategies that actually work in this research environment. We'll also touch on a few common pitfalls that can keep brick walls thinking longer than they need to. My hope is that by the end of today, you'll walk away feeling more confident, not because Southern research suddenly became easy, but because you'll have a clearer way forward even when the records aren't perfect. So let's get started. So let's talk about what actually makes Southern research so uniquely difficult, because one of the most important things you can understand as a genealogist is this. The problem you're running into are not random. They're not bad luck, and they're not because they're missing something obvious. Southern brick walls are structural. They're built into the history of the region itself. The first major challenge is record loss. Many southern counties experience courthouse fires, floods, or other disasters that completely destroy records, not damage them, but wipe them out entirely. And in some places, this happened more than once. When people ask, weren't there copies elsewhere? Sometimes yes, but very often, especially in rural areas, the courthouse was the only copy. When it burned, the records were simply gone forever. On top of that, we have the impact of war, especially the Civil War. Record keeping broke down across large parts of the South during those years. Courthouses were destroyed or occupied, clerks enlisted or fled, and documentation simply stopped being in many places. Even when records were created, they often weren't preserved properly afterwards. So we end up with multi-year gaps where our ancestors seem to vanish, not because they disappeared, but because the system that documented their lives collapsed. Then there's migration, which is another huge factor. Southern families move constantly, usually short distances, not dramatic cross-country moves. Someone might relocate 15 or 20 miles into a neighboring county, which puts them in a completely different jurisdiction with different records. From our perspective today, it looks like they fell off the map, but they didn't disappear. They just moved the way people did all the time. Another challenge, and one that causes a lot of confusion, is name reuse. Southern families reuse the same given name over and over again across generations. You'll often find multiple men with the same name living in the same county at the same time. Fathers, sons, uncles, cousins, sometimes even the same community. And on top of that, Southerners frequently use nicknames instead of legal names. In my own family, my grandmother's brothers were legally named Charles and Jimmy, but everyone called them Bub and Fella. And in some records, that's exactly how they appear, especially in the census. I had to call my grandmother's sister just to confirm what their actual legal names were. So when you combine reused names and nicknames, especially in incomplete records, separating individuals becomes incredibly difficult unless you're paying close attention to context. Finally, we have to acknowledge that record keeping itself was often informal. Not every birth, marriage, or death was documented, particularly in rural areas. And even when records were created, many weren't preserved long term. Sometimes they were lost to disaster, sometimes they were simply never treated as permanent records in the first place. When you put all of this together, record loss, war, disruption, constant migration, reused names, nicknames, and informal documentation, what you get in a research environment that is genuinely challenging. Southern brick walls are not the result of poor research or lack of effort. They're the product of historical realities that shaped how records were created and preserved. Understanding that is critical because it changes the question to ask when you hit a wall. Instead of what did I do wrong, you should start asking how do I work within these limitations? And that shift from self blame to strategy is where real process begins. All right, now I want to talk about something that tripped up Southern researchers more than almost anything else. I call it the myth of the missing record, and I hear some version of it all the time. It usually sounds like if I could just find that one record, the marriage, the will, the deed, everything would finally make sense. There's this belief somewhere out there is this one perfect document that will solve the problem and break the brick wall wide open. And that belief is completely understandable. It makes sense. This is how most of us are taught to do genealogy from the very beginning. We're trained to look for specific record types, censuses, birth records, marriage licenses, probate files. And those records are important. They're foundational. But here's the reality of Southern research. The expectation often works against us. In many Southern communities, especially rural ones, and especially in earlier time periods, a lot of records were never created in the first place. Births happened without being registered, marriages took place without paperwork ever being filed, deaths, deaths occurred without any formal documentation unless there was property or a legal reason to record it. This wasn't negligence, it was simply how life worked in many places. Families knew who belonged to whom, and there wasn't a system that required everything to be written down and preserved in a courthouse. And in other cases, records were created, but only locally. They existed in one place and one place only. So when that courthouse burned, flooded, or shut down during the war, those records didn't get damaged. They disappeared. There were no backup, no state level copies. Even when preservation was attempted, time wasn't kind. Records were damaged by water, insects, mold, or neglect. They were moved, misplaced, or thrown out, and many valuable details existed only in informal sources. Family Bibles, church notes, letters, diaries, materials that were never meant to serve as official records and weren't systematically preserved. So when we approach Southern genealogy, believing that there must be one definitive record waiting to be found, research often grinds to a halt. We keep checking the same places over and over. We research the same databases. We think maybe I just missed it, and months, sometimes years pass with no progress because the record we're waiting for may never have existed at all. But here's the key point. That does not mean the research is impossible. What it means is that the strategy has to change. Southern genealogy often requires us to build conclusions gradually, using many smaller pieces of evidence rather than one perfect document. It's about patterns over time. It's about association. who live near whom, who witnessed whose documents, who appeared together repeatedly in records, who migrated together. This is where methodology becomes crucial. When direct evidence is missing, how we evaluate evidence matters just as much as what we find. Reasoning matters, context matters, the ability to connect fragmentary forces responsibly matters. So instead of asking, where is the record I need, we start asking, what evidence is this and how can I use it well? And that's the shift we're going to build on next. All right, now we're getting into what I consider one of the most important, honestly, one of the hardest mindset shifts in Southern genealogy. Learning when to stop chasing a single individual and start widening a lens. When we hit a brick wall, it's completely natural to laser focus on one person. You've got that ancestor you're desperate to push back another generation. You want their parents, their origin, their birth date. So you start searching their name again and again. Every database, every index, every possible spelling, you keep thinking, if I just look one more time, something new will show up and it'll all click. And I get that impulse. I've done it myself. We all have. But here's the problem. People in the past didn't live in isolation. They lived within families, churches, neighborhoods, and communities. And records were created in that context. Deeds don't just name buyers and sellers, they name neighbors and witnesses. Court records list associates, bondmen, and security. Church records reflect entire congregations and family groups. Tax lists show clusters of families living near each other year after year. All of the information is there, but when we focus only on one name, we often miss the very context that explains who that person was connected to and where they came from. So instead of thinking only about individuals, we need to start thinking in families, and not just the nuclear family, I mean the extended network. Siblings, spouses, in-laws, aunts, uncles, cousins, because very often the person at the center of your brick wall left very few records themselves. But their brother bought land, their sister witnessed a deed, or their father-in-law left a will that named everyone. And I'll give you a quick example from my own family because this is something I see all the time. I spent a long time trying to find my grandmother, my great grandmother in the 1910 census, and I was convinced she had to be living with her parents. So that's where I kept looking over and over again. I couldn't find her anywhere. What I eventually realized was that I was asking the wrong question. Her mother had died in the 1910s, and her father sent her to live with her sister in the next town over. She was there the whole time, just not where I expected her to be. And if I hadn't researched her siblings and widened that land, I never would have found her. That's the shift I want you to make. Beyond family, we also need to think in communities. Neighbors and associates weren't random. People migrated together, fell near people they already knew, and showed up together in records over and over again. So when you see the same name, witnessing documents, living near each other on censuses, or exchanging land repeatedly, those patterns matter, even when relationships aren't stated outright. It's also important to think across generations. Sometimes the best clues about ancestors don't come from their own record at all, but from their children or grandchildren. People who lived longer moved to areas with better record keeping or left clearer paper trails. When you widen the lens this way, when you stop chasing one name and start studying the network around them, patterns begin to emerge. Migration makes sense. Family structure becomes clearer. Brick walls start to loosen. So if you take nothing else away from this section, take this. Stop chasing just one person. Look at the family. Look at the community. Look at the pattern. That's where the answers usually are. Okay, so once we widen the lens beyond a single individual and started thinking in terms of families and communities, the next step is learning how to use context itself as evidence. And this is huge. This is where a lot of breakthroughs in Southern research actually happen. When we first learned genealogy, we're taught to think of evidence as documents, census records, deeds, will, marriage licenses, and those records are foundational. We absolutely need them. But in Southern research especially, documents rarely tell the whole story on their own. Context is what helps us understand what those records are actually saying, and just as importantly, what they're not saying. Context fills in gaps, explains silences, and helps us make sense of things that look confusing or contradictory at first glance. So let me break down what I mean by context into a few key areas. First, geography. Geography is absolutely critical in Southern research. Where people lived, how close they were to one another, how roads and rivers shaped movement, and how county boundaries changed over time, all affect what records exist and where those records are today. Your ancestor might have lived in the same house their entire adult life and never moved at all. But if the county lines shifted around them, they can appear in multiple county records over time. If you don't understand those boundary changes, it can look like migration when none actually happened and you end up searching in all the wrong places. Geography also tells you who was truly a neighbor. 15 miles apart might mean nothing today, but in the 1830s, it could be the next farm over, or it could be a completely separate community. Understanding the landscape matters. Next is economy, how people made their living. This is something that gets overlooked far too often, but it explains a lot about movement and record patterns. A family of tenant farmers likely move frequently and may never appear in land records at all. That doesn't mean they weren't there. It means you need to look for them in the tax list, agricultural schedules, or other local records. On the other hand, skilled tradesmen, blacksmiths, millers, coopers, often failed in very specific places where their services were needed. Knowing an ancestor's occupation can help you predict where they might have gone and when they moved. Religion is another major piece of context in Southern research. Church affiliation often determined where people settled, who they associated with, and where the records were kept. If your ancestors were Baptists and moved from North Carolina into Tennessee in the late 1700s, there's a very good chance they settled near other Baptist families and near an established Baptist church. In many rural communities, the church was the most consistent record keeping institution that existed. Church minutes, membership lists, baptism, marriages, and burials often preserve information that civil records never captured, especially in areas where official record keeping was informal or non existent. And finally, there were social norms, the unwritten rules that shaped how people lived. Inheritance customs, naming traditions, family expectations, and community practices all influence how records were created and how we need to interpret them today. If you know that the youngest son typically inherited the home place in a particular area, a will suddenly makes sense. If you understand that children were often named after grandparents or other relatives, recurring names stop being random and start becoming clues. When you put all of this together, geography, economy, religion, social norm, context becomes evident. It helps you evaluate whether a conclusion actually makes sense within the historical world your ancestors lived in. Now, I want to be very clear. Context does not replace documentation. We can't use it to force a conclusion or fill the answers we wish we had. But what context does do is guide better questions, smarter searches, and more accurate interpretations of the evidence we do have. So when Southern research feels confusing or contradictory, step back and ask, what did the broader context tell me? What was happening here? How did the community function? Very often, that question is the key that unlocks everything. So context is evidence, so use it. So once we started thinking in terms of family, community, and contact. It becomes pretty clear why relying on the census alone often is enough in Southern research. And I get why we do it. The census feels like the backbone of genealogy, where we start and where we keep coming back to. Census records are incredibly valuable. But here's the problem. They're snapshots. They're taken once every 10 years and they only tell us what was true on one specific day each decade. So if a family moved frequently, which Southern families often did, or if records are missing, or if you're dealing with reused names, those snapshots can leave huge gaps. You might see someone in 1850 and then they're gone in 1860 with no clear explanation. Did they move? Did they die? Did they get missed by the enumerator? All of those are real possibilities. This is where other record types become not just helpful but essential. First, land and tax records. These are some of the most consistently useful sources in Southern research, and they're often underused. Even when vital records don't survive, which is common in the South, land and tax records can track families year by year and place them very precisely within a community. Land records show where someone lived, who their family were, who they bought from and sold to, and who witnessed the transaction. Tax lists show who was present in a county year after year. And because county needed tax revenue to function, these records were often created even when other record keeping fell apart. If someone appears on tax lists in the same district for 10 years, you know they stayed put. If they disappeared from one county tax list and appear in another the following year, you know they moved, and you know exactly where they went. Another record type that can be incredibly useful for filling gaps between censuses is voter registration lists, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century. These lists can place men in specific counties or districts during years when no census exists. They're especially helpful when you're tracking movement or trying to separate two men with the same name. Now, absence from a voter list doesn't prove someone wasn't there. There are lots of reasons someone might not appear, but when they do appear, it's solid confirmation of presence at a specific point in time. Next, probate records, and these are absolutely critical. Will, estate, file, inventory, guardianship, and administration bonds often identify relationships that don't appear anywhere else. A will may name all of a person's children, including married daughters. A state division can list heirs, spouses, and residences. Guardianship records often identify close relatives who stepped in to care for minor children. Even when someone died without a will, the probate process still generated records that place people in family and community contact. Church records are another key source, especially in Southern research. Churches were often the center of community life, and in rural areas, they were often the only institution keeping consistent records. Membership lists can show when a family arrived in a community. Baptisms often named both parents. Minister kept marriage records, sometimes survived when county records were lost. Burial records can document deaths when no civil record exists. And finally, the court minutes. These are frequently overlooked, but they document the everyday workings of local government. Court minutes record estate businesses, road assignments, debt disputes, licenses, and appointments, all of which help place people geographically and socially within a community. What makes court minutes especially valuable is that they often survive when other records don't. They were usually kept in bound volumes, so when loose papers were lost, the minutes sometimes made it through. When you use all of these sources together, land, tax, voter registration, probate, church records, court minutes, and yes, the census, you start to create continuity across time. Instead of relying on one record and hoping it has all the answers, Southern research works best when you layer multiple record types and let patterns emerge. When you see the same person buying land, paying taxes, witnessing documents, registering to vote, and appearing in the census in the same place, you can be confident you've got the right individual. This approach takes patience. You won't find one record that answers everything, but it produces far clearer and more reliable results than relying on the census alone ever could. So don't limit yourself to the census. Cast a wider net, use everything that's available, and let the full picture emerge. All right, now we're getting into a topic that makes a lot of people nervous, but it's absolutely essential for Southern research, and that's indirect evidence. If you research Southern families long enough, you will always inevitably reach a point where no single document states the relationship outright. There's no record that says John Smith, son of William Smith. There's no will that neatly names all the children. There's no family Bible laying everything out for you. The direct evidence you want either doesn't exist anymore or never existed at all. And this is where indirect evidence becomes essential. Now, I want to be very clear about something right away. Indirect evidence is not guessing. It is not sloppy research, and it is not doing genealogy wrong. Indirect evidence is a well-established, legitimate genealogical methodology. It means building conclusions by looking at patterns across multiple records over time, rather than relying on a single document to tell you everything. In Southern research especially, this isn't optional. It's often the only way forward. One of the most important ways we use indirect evidence is by tracking repeated association. When you see the same group of people appearing together again and again across different record types, tax lists, land transactions, probate files, church records, these connections matter. People didn't randomly associate with the same individual for decades. When the same name consistently appear together, that usually points to family relationships or very close community ties. And when you're trying to identify parent, sibling, or origin, the repeated associations are some of the strongest clues you can get. Geographic clustering is another powerful form of indirect evidence. Southern families often live near one another for generations. Brothers settled on adjacent lands. Parents live near adult children. Extended families clustered into the same district year after year. This helps in two major ways. First, it helps people separate people with the same name. If you have two men named John Smith in the same county, but one consistently appears in records in the northern district and the other in the southern district, you can start distinguishing them based on location. Second, geographic clustering can suggest kinship even when no record states it outright. If two men live next door to each other for decades, witnessed each other's documents, attended the same church, and their children intermarried, there's a strong likelihood they were related, even if the exact relationship isn't spelled out in surviving records. So instead of asking, did this one document prove the relationship, which is how we think when we're relying on direct evidence, indirect evidence asks a broader question. Do all of these pieces taken together point in the same direction? When you have multiple independent records created at different times for different purposes that consistently support the same conclusion, that conclusion becomes stronger, even if no single document explicitly states it. Now, this approach can absolutely require care and documentation. You can't hand wave it. You can't just say they were probably related and move on. Each piece of evidence needs to be evaluated on its own merits. You need to think about a source, reliability, context, what the record does and doesn't say, and how it fits with the other evidence. And your conclusion needs to be clearly explained so that someone else or you in 5 years can follow your reasoning. Good genealogy is transparent. It shows the work. It distinguishes between what's proven, what's probable, and what's possible. And this part is really important. Indirect evidence is not a lesser form of research. It is explicitly recognized by the genealogical proof standard as valid and necessary, especially in regions in the South where record loss is widespread. For many Southern families, the direct evidence is simply gone, but the indirect evidence is still there in patterns and associations and geography. If you know how to look for it and how to use it responsibly. So don't be afraid of indirect evidence. Learn to work with it carefully, document clearly, and will open doors you may have thought were permanently closed. Let's talk about one of the most frustrating Southern research problems of all, the so-called disappearing ancestor. You know the situation. You've got someone on the 1820 census. They buy land in 1825. They're on the tax list in 1828. They appear on the 1830 census. And then suddenly they're gone. No census, no land, no tax record. You search everywhere, try every spelling, check the same county over and over, and it feels like they just vanished. But here's the reality. In the vast majority of cases, ancestors didn't disappear, they moved. Migration was incredibly common in the South, far more common than many researchers expect, especially if they're used to regions where families stay put for generations. Southern families move frequently, but what's important to understand is how they moved. Most Southern migration was short distance. We're usually not talking about dramatic leaps across the country in one generation. More often, families moved one county over into a newly formed county or along familiar routes into nearby areas where land or work had become available. Moves that might only be 15 or 20 miles, but that completely changed the record you need to search. People moved for practical reasons. Land wore out, better opportunities opened up nearby, children came of age and needed farms or work. New towns formed, roads were built. These moves weren't random, they were logical responses to opportunity. And because migration was so common, tracking it worked best when we stopped following individuals in isolation and start following groups. Family, neighbors, and entire communities often migrated together. They maintained their social and kinship networks as they moved. This is something I've seen clearly in my own family. My great grandparents moved from Appalachia in Tennessee to Indiana in the early 20th century. On paper, it looked like one family suddenly relocating out of state. But when I stepped back and looked at the broader picture, the story made sense. My great grandfather worked in the steel industry, and an opportunity opened up in Indiana that offered better pay. So he moved, but he didn't move alone. His siblings moved, other relatives followed. Cousins showed up in the same area. Entire family networks shifted together because the opportunity shifted. If I had only followed my great grandparents in isolation, that move would have looked random and confusing. But when I followed the group, the migration pattern became clear. This is why checking adjacent counties and sometimes adjacent states is absolutely critical in Southern research. Very often the answer isn't far away, it's just across the county line. And sometimes your ancestor didn't really move at all, the county line moved around them. New counties were constantly being formed throughout the 1800s, and someone could live in the same house for decades and still appear in multiple counties simply because boundaries change. Beyond county lines, it also helps to think in terms of migration routes, not just dots on a map. Rivers functioned as highways, roads followed earlier trails, economic opportunities guided settlement patterns. When you understand where people from a particular area tended to go, you can often predict where your own family might reappear. When you combine the understanding of migration with the other tools we talked about, indirect evidence, repeated association, geographic clustering, movement that once felt impossible to trace often becomes surprisingly clear. You start to see the story, why they left, where they likely went, and who they went with. Instead of staring at a brick wall feeling stuck, you suddenly have concrete places to search next. Tracking migration this way as a group process, guided by roots and patterns, is one of the most powerful tools we have in Southern genealogy. So once you understand that your ancestors didn't disappear, they just moved, you really can find them again. By this point, I hope it's clear that Southern brick walls aren't just about missing records or historical disasters beyond our control. Those factors are real and they matter. But there's another piece we need to talk about honestly, and that's how our own research habits can sometimes keep those brick walls standing longer than they need to. This isn't about blame. I've done every single one of these things myself. We all have, especially when we've been stuck in the same problem for a long time. Frustration changes how we think, and sometimes it pushes us into patterns that actually work against us. So, I want to walk through a few of the most common ones. One big issue is ignoring context. When you're deep into the weeds, it's very easy to tunnel vision on names and dates. We're so focused on finding that person, that record, that we stop asking whether the story we're building actually makes sense. We stop thinking about geography. We stop asking whether someone realistically could have moved that far. We stop considering how their community functioned or what their economic reality looked like. And that's how people end up building entire trees on a name match alone. A matching name is not the same thing as a correct identification, especially in the South. Context is what keeps us grounded. Without it, it's very easy to go wrong without realizing it. Another major issue, and this one is especially tempting in Southern research, is jumping generations without enough evidence. When records are sparse, the urge to make a connection can be incredibly strong. You see two people with the same name in different places or time periods, and the timeline could work, so you connect them and move on. It feels like progress. But very often that jump creates more problems than it solves. You end up with the wrong parents, or you conflate two different people, and suddenly nothing else makes sense because you're building on a shaky foundation. Southern research already asks us to work with limited evidence, which makes it even more important to be cautious, not less. And then there's forcing conclusions. This happens when we want an answer so badly that we start fitting the evidence to a theory we've already decided on. We give extra weight to records that support our idea and minimize or explain away the ones that don't. We tell ourselves the inconsistency isn't a big deal, instead of treating it as a sign that something might be off. And I want to be very clear about this. This isn't about being a bad researcher. The human response to uncertainty and frustration. Our brains want closure. We want the problem solved. But good genealogy isn't about how fast we get an answer, it's how well the answer holds up. So, what do we do instead? The first step is simple recognition, not judgment or awareness. Asking yourself questions like, am I ignoring context here? Am I making the connection because the evidence supports it or because I want it to be true? Am I willing to say, I don't know yet? Once you recognize these moments, you can step back, you can slow down, you can widen your lens again. You can reevaluate what that evidence actually says, independent of what you hoped it would say. And very often that shift is what finally allows progress to happen. Sometimes it's the breakthrough isn't sometimes the breakthrough isn't a new record at all. Sometimes it's changing how we think about the record we already have. We talked today about strategies and techniques and ways to push forward when Southern research feels stuck. But I want to talk now about something I consider one of the most important skills in genealogy, and that's when to step back. We tend to think of progress as constant forward motion. Keep searching, keep digging, keep pushing until you break through. And persistence absolutely matters. But in genealogy, especially Southern genealogy, some of the most productive moments don't come from pushing hard, they come from pausing and reassessing. So, how do you know when it's time to step back? One clear sign is conflicting evidence that doesn't make sense. If ages don't line up, locations don't work, timelines feel strange, or a new record raise more questions than answers, that's often a signal that something in your framework needs to be re-examined. Maybe you've got the wrong person. Maybe a relationship has been misidentified. Maybe there's missing context that needs attention. When that happens, the instinct often is to push harder, to keep searching for one more record that will magically fix everything. But very often, what's needed instead is to stop and really evaluate what you already have. What assumptions are you making, and are those assumptions actually supported by the evidence? Another important sign is stacking assumptions. This happens when one unproven idea gets built on top of another. I think this person was the father. And if that's true, then they probably moved here. And if they moved here, then this must be their son. Before long, you're several generations deep in a line that's built mostly on probably and likely with very little solid evidence underneath. That kind of structure is fragile. One wrong assumption early on can throw everything else off. If you notice that most of your conclusions are conditional rather than corporic, that's a sign it's time to pause and strengthen the foundation before continuing. And then there's frustration, which is one of the most important signals of all. When research starts to feel circular, when you're searching the same places repeatedly and finding nothing new, or when it starts to feel emotionally exhausting rather than engaging, that doesn't mean the answer is unreachable. It usually means your current approach needs adjusting. Frustration clouds judgment. When we're worn down, we're more likely to miss things, misinterpret evidence, or force connections just to feel like we're making progress. That's human, but it's also a sign that it's time to step back, at least temporarily. Now, stepping back does not mean giving up. It means protecting the accuracy of your work and preserving your ability to think clearly. It might mean taking time to document what you know, what you don't know, and what assumptions you've been making. It might mean revisiting sources you've already used now that you understand the family or community better. Or it might mean shifting your focus to a related line or a different part of the family for a while. I can't tell you how many times I've been completely stuck, stepped away for a few weeks or months, and then came back and immediately seen something I missed before. The record didn't change, I did. My perspective changed. In Southern genealogy, especially, patience isn't just a virtue, it's a necessity. The records are incomplete, the answers aren't always immediate, and that's okay. Allowing yourself to pause, reflect, and think critically rather than searching frantically is often exactly what leads to the next real breakthrough. So don't be afraid to step back when you need to. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. As we start to bring everything together, I want to emphasize something really important. Successful Southern research is almost never about luck or sudden dramatic breakthroughs. We've all heard those stories. I was stuck for 10 years and then I found one record and everything fell into place. And yes, those moments do happen sometimes, and they're wonderful when they do. But the reality of solid, reliable Southern research that actually holds up over time is that it's usually methodical. It's systematic. It's built slowly as evidence accumulates and conclusions form gradually rather than all at once. So, what does a methodical approach actually look like in practice? The first key is building clusters. We talked about this throughout the presentation, the idea that we stop focusing on a single individual in isolation and instead look at families, neighbors, associates, and entire communities as connected groups. This isn't just a helpful technique, it's fundamental to how Southern research works. When you deliberately build out these clusters, documenting siblings, in-laws, neighbors, witnesses, and recurring associates, patterns start to appear that you simply cannot see when you're focused on one name alone. You start to notice that certain families migrate together, that specific surnames intermarry across generations, that when your ancestor appears in a new county, the same handful of families appear right alongside them. The cluster approach takes more time up front, but what it gives you in return is clarity and context, and the ability to solve problems that are unsolvable when you're searching for just one person in isolation. The second piece is tracking patterns. When the names, locations, and associations keep appearing across different record types over long periods of time, that repetition matters, it's not random. If John Smith and William Jones witness each other's deeds, appear next to each other on tax lists, and later show up connected through probate or marriage, that pattern is telling you a story. Even if no document ever spelled out the exact relationship, the pattern itself becomes evident. And this is especially powerful in Southern research because we so often lack neat, explicit statements of relationships. We may not have a perfect record, but we do have a repeated association. And when those associations are tracked carefully and consistently, they can support very strong, well-reasoned conclusions. And none of this works without the third piece, documentation. Clear, thorough documentation is what keeps your research flexible and accurate over time. It's what allows you to return to a problem months later and immediately understand what you've already tried, what you know, what you don't know yet, and why you reached the conclusions you did. It's also what allows you to revise your conclusions responsibly when new evidence appears, which will happen in Southern research. Documentation isn't the most exciting part of genealogy, but it's what separates research that holds up from research that collapses under scrutiny. Now, I want to be honest, this kind of methodical approach does not eliminate brick walls overnight. You're not going to adopt these practices and suddenly have all your answers quick, but what it does do is ensure that progress continues, even when it's slow, even when it feels incremental. In Southern genealogy especially, breakthroughs usually come through steady accumulation rather than dramatic discovery. One small piece of evidence leads to another. A cluster becomes clear, a pattern emerges, a connection strengthens, and over time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes years, that steady work adds up to conclusions. They're reliable, defensible, and deeply satisfying because you know exactly how you got there. That's the goal. Not quick answers, but right answers. Not lucky breaks, but sustainable methodology. That's how you break Southern brick walls and make them stay broken. As we wrap up our time together today, I want to come back to a few key ideas that I hope you'll carry with you when you return to your own research. First, and this is the most important thing I want you to hear, brick walls are completely normal and an expected part of Southern genealogy. They are not unusual. They are not a sign that you failed or you're not skilled enough or that you're doing something wrong. In many cases, Southern brick walls exist because of historical realities we can't change. Record loss, war, constant migration, and informal documentation practices. That's the research landscape we're working in. It's not your fault and it's not something you caused. So please stop blaming yourself when you hit a wall. Sometimes the answer isn't findable in a single record because that record no longer exists or never existed in the first place. That doesn't mean the research is over. It just means the strategy has to change. Which brings me to my second point. Method matters. When records are incomplete or missing, which they so often are in Southern research, progress depends less on luck and more on how we approach the problem. Widening the lens beyond one individual, paying attention to context, building clusters, tracking patterns, using indirect evidence responsibly, documenting your reasoning, knowing when to step back and reassess. These choices are what make forward movement possible even without perfect documentation. Brick walls don't usually fall because of one dramatic discovery. They shift because of steady, thoughtful, methodical work over time. And finally, especially if you've been feeling discouraged, feeling stuck does not mean you're doing genealogy wrong. It often means you've reached a point where a different approach is needed, a wider focus, different records, a pause, a fresh perspective. Gathering research rewards patience. It rewards flexibility, and when we allow ourselves to slow down and think critically rather than search frantically, those walls that once felt permanent often do begin to move, sometimes slowly, sometimes unexpectedly, but they move. So don't give up. Keep learning, keep refining your method, be patient with yourself and the process. And remember that every researcher, no matter how experienced, encounters these same challenges. You are not alone in this. Thank you again to the Allen County Public Library Genealogy Center for inviting me to be here today. And thank you all for spending your valuable research time with me. I'm truly honored. I'd be happy to take any questions now, or if you'd like to talk through a specific research challenge, I'm glad you did that as well. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. The one question I see in the chat is what are the best ways to encourage the descendants of slaveholders to share documents that include the names of enslaved people? What websites do you encourage people to upload data so it's accessible to the descendants of those who were enslaved?
Well, I will be honest, I'm not as experienced in slave holders and slave. I'm working on becoming more experienced at it, but I'm not as experienced at that. But I think, just opening a dialogue and saying, hey, I need this record or such and such record. But otherwise, I think I'm not as experienced in that. So, but it's something I'm looking into.
As far as websites to upload data, I mean, I would suggest Family Search because it's free.
Yeah,
So people also like to use Ancestry as well, but
yeah.
yeah. Okay, so the person who had asked that question just put a link to another website. Sonia, why don't you put that in the chat so everybody can see it? Okay, so the next question, what strategies do you suggest to research a family where the children of a first marriage were never reported?
I think the best thing is to, if they were never recorded as far as like birth certificates or whatever, I would really start looking at obituary, uh, will, probate records, see if anybody is mentioned in there. Because, a lot of times, even though they aren't listed, documented on birth record, they often show up in other ways.
You offered some really great tips, and I
Yeah.
think some new ways of thinking about it because it's not always the most direct approach.
Yeah, it's not. Unfortunately, whenever I started doing research, because my paternal grandfather is from Indiana, but all three of my other grandparents are from Tennessee. So whenever I started with my own history, it was like I was like constantly looking for a name, birth record. But when I got into the record, it was like, oh, that doesn't exist. Sometimes I need to go indirectly and find some other document that could say somebody right or somebody here.
All right, so since we're about out of questions, we're about at time. So thank you again, Kelsey, for
Oh,
a great presentation.
well, thank you for having me.
Thanks to all of you for tuning in.
Bye. Have a good day.